So it turns out that there are many of us who enjoy a nice warm cup of tea on a moist morning, but it turns out that one of the reasons why we might actually like tea has to do with the bacteria that are involved in the tea making process. We're going to talk about all this and so very much more on today's episode of Short Stories of Bacteria. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Short Stories of Bacteria. I, as always, am your host, Dr. K, and I'm here to guide you through yet another exciting and fun story about the lives of the tiny and the infamous, that would be, of course, the incredible, the inspirational, the amazing, the fascinating bacteria, and all such associated microorganisms. Thanks each and every single one of you guys for tuning in. If this is your first or second or third time, whichever time it is, if you are, depending on the type of medium that you are engaging with the content, if you're listening to this on podcasts on like Spotify or Apple Podcasts, don't forget to hit that follow button. Don't forget to share it. Don't forget to give us a 5-star review. That's super helpful for the podcast. If you are engaging with Short Stories of Bacteria on YouTube, now that we have a YouTube channel going on, that's really awesome. Don't forget to hit that like, share, subscribe, and all that good stuff. It's weird because now I have to change my whole spiel from exclusively talking about the podcast side to now engaging with the whole YouTube channel thing. So that's very exciting. But enough of that nonsense. Let's talk a little bit about bacteria. And what we're going to be talking about today is how bacteria interact with our experience of flavor. And you may know a little bit about this, but there's also some kind of counterintuitive ways that bacteria influence the flavor that we experience. Now, one of the biggest ways is just by changing the foods that we experience. It turns out, obviously, through fermentation is one of the most common ways that we think about this. We ferment things like beer, we ferment things like kombucha, we ferment things like tea, which we'll talk about in a second. But we also ferment other types of foods, things like kimchi. Turns out chocolate, a whole lot of fermentation is involved in the process of making chocolate, right? So there's a whole bunch of different mechanisms by which bacteria and other microorganisms change the chemical makeup or the biochemical makeup of a lot of the foods and drinks that we experience. Now, one of those foods / drinks is tea, also known as Camellia sinensis. I actually never knew what the technical term for the tea leaf was or the tea plant was, but it's Camellia sinensis. Camellia sinensis is, again, the definitive tea plant. And you may know this, there's a whole bunch of different kinds of teas, right? So there's black teas and green teas and white teas, so-called oolong tea, which is something that I learned recently during boba excursions. But the long and short of it is each of these different types of teas, one way that you're separating these things out is by the degree of fermentation. So how long you do fermentation for these Camellia sinensis tea leaves dictates what kind of tea you're going to be getting, whether again be the white tea or the green tea or the oolong tea. Now, that's one way that bacteria influence the flavor that we experience, by editing food or drink before we actually consume it. The other way, and this is the more counterintuitive way, is sometimes it can influence our food in our mouths. Our oral microbiome is super huge here. If you think about it this way, whenever we're eating something, we're consuming some kind of biomolecule, right? And then that's broken down into other molecules that we can experience in our palate, right? It breaks down the biomolecule, and then we can experience it in a new way. Now, one of the things the oral microbiome, again, the bacteria that occupy our mouth, they're also interacting with the biomolecules as we consume them. And so they're also adding their own little teeny tiny tweaks to how these biomolecules are edited or broken down. Now, what that means then is that depending on your oral microbiome, and this is my current hypothesis, and I think there's a little bit of evidence to suggest that this is true, is that depending on your oral microbiome, that can alter the ratio or the amount of these different compounds that are being generated as we break down biomolecules. And in doing so, that can edit how we perceive flavor. So there's a couple questions that I still have related to that, but I think that's an emerging hypothesis. Now, so that's really cool. So bacteria and other microorganisms, they influence the way that we experience food. Number one, by changing food and drink itself. And then number two, by mediating the way that we experience these biomolecules that we're consuming. Okay, so that's great. Now, how does this relate to tea? Well, I already mentioned earlier that the degree of fermentation by these microorganisms dictates the type of tea that we, or the type of tea that we consume. But a lot of this actually has to do with the flavor of the tea, or the almost like the tea-ness of the tea. Because it turns out that something that is very closely involved with the quality of tea and the flavor of tea, it all hinges around this biomolecule called L-theanine. L-theanine. So L-theanine is a type of amino acid, and it's what gives tea its kind of tea flavor. Not only is it give tea its tea flavor, but number one, it's associated with high quality tea. So if you have elevated levels of L-theanine in your tea, then you have a higher quality tea. So that's great. And number two, it's also associated with all the different types of health benefits that you see with tea. So like this anti-inflammation, antioxidants, all these different components of tea that are good for you. There's some things that could have anti-cancer stuff, but that, again, I don't know all that much about that specific type of science. But the main point being is that these benefits that you get from tea seem to be mediated through this amino acid L-theanine. Okay, so if you have high levels of L-theanine, then you have a higher quality tea and you have better health benefits. So in general, you want to have a version of tea that has elevated levels of L-theanine. Great. Now, this actually leads into a paper that came out, it was about a month ago, somewhere in the middle of February from, let me see if I got this right. This is the Fujian Agriculture and Forestry University in China. The Fujian Agriculture and Forestry University in China. Right? And so what these guys were doing is they were looking at Camellia sinensis. Again, this is the tea plant. And they were trying to figure out how is it that these levels of L-theanine can be influenced. Now, what they found out actually was really, really cool. And again, it had to do with these bacteria. And the relationship between L-theanine and bacteria, it has a lot to do with this thing called nitrogen fixation, right? So I guess we need a little bit of background here. So all of the things that every single one of the organisms in the whole wide world, whether it be bacteria or humans or plants or animals, whatever the case may be, we all need nitrogen in some form, right? You need nitrogen as a way of synthesizing amino acids. If you need nitrogen for synthesizing amino acids, then you need nitrogen as a way of synthesizing polypeptides and proteins. And you need those polypeptides and proteins in order to have a functional cell. So every single one of the organisms in the entirety of the world needs to have nitrogen in some way. The problem is that even though nitrogen is vastly abundant, I think it's something to the tune of like 70% of our atmosphere, right? The vast majority of nitrogen is in a form that we can't readily use, right? So it's right there, but we can't use it. Now, what nitrogen fixation is, and it's kind of implied in the name, is a way of extracting that nitrogen from the environment and converting it or fixing it into something that's a little more readily usable. Okay, that's the game plan behind nitrogen fixation. Now, the way that this is done actually uses bacteria. So there are these things called nitrogen fixing bacteria, and what they do, again, is they grab the environmental nitrogen and they convert it into something called ammonia. Once they convert it into ammonia, that's a lot more readily usable by things like plants. And I think I need to double check this one. I think a little bit, we can use a little bit of ammonia ourselves, but nowhere near to the degree that something like a plant can. But anyway, the overall pathway is bacteria extracts nitrogen from the environment, converts it into ammonium. They sit at the roots of these plants, and then the plants then can use that ammonia, right, and convert it into something, or can utilize that, as a way of synthesizing these amino acids, right? So that's how it works. Now, what the researchers figured out, they figured out a couple of different things. First of all, they figured out that the level of nitrogen fixation, right? So if you had a whole bunch of nitrogen fixation, this led to elevated levels of L-theanine. And as we mentioned a second ago, elevated levels of L-theanine means better tea and better health benefits from tea, right? So elevated levels of nitrogen fixation led to elevated levels of L-theanine. Awesome. The next point that they made was actually really cool. They found that something really relevant to this nitrogen fixation is the bacteria. I mentioned a second ago how bacteria, they're the things that are doing the nitrogen fixation, right? They grab the nitrogen and they convert it into ammonia, right? So you can envision a situation such that the type of bacteria that exist in the microbiome of a plant, right, really dictates how much nitrogen fixation is happening and how much ammonium is being generated. Okay? So what the researchers did, they came up with this idea. So they thought to themselves, okay, let's just take a really high theanine producing plant, right? let's look at its root structure and let's see if we can extract the microbiome from that root structure. The thought being is that if we extract that microbiome, that's probably one that's doing really good nitrogen fixation because this plant has a whole bunch of L-theanine, right? That's the game plan. So what they did is they extracted the microbiome from these roots. They made a so-called synthetic microbiome. And then what they did is they took that microbiome and they transplanted it to a different kind of tea plant. Right? And the next thing that happened was really cool. So this new kind of tea plant that didn't produce a whole lot of L-theanine to begin with, right? Because it had this new microbiome that it extracted from a high-quality tea plant, it allowed this low-quality tea plant to start producing elevated levels of L-theanine. And as it did that, it became a higher-quality tea plant, had higher health benefits. It's really, really cool. It's a really neat instance of how the microbiome of tea, or just plants in general, right? How these microbiomes not only influence the flavor that we experience or the types of food that we're experiencing, but they could also influence things like health benefits and quality of food. Anyway, let's wrap all this up. I know I've been yammering on for a good long while and I want to wrap this up. So number one, bacteria, they influence our food and the flavor that we experience. Right, in a number of different ways. Number two, foods like tea, the quality that they have and the tea-like flavor that they have is based around a compound called L-theanine. Number three, the degree of L-theanine production, and i.e. the quality of that tea, hinges on the amount of nitrogen fixation that's being done by bacteria at the root structure of these tea plants. And finally, number four, you can take a synthetic microbiome from a high theanine producing plant, give it to a low theanine producing plant, and then have it produce elevated levels of L-theanine, thereby increasing the quality and just making a better overall tea plant. Again, it's a really, really neat instance of how bacteria can be used to make make food better, make it taste better, make it more high quality, and also make it healthier. But anyway, guys, that is all I have time for today. Thank you, every single one of you. Thank you so much for tuning in on the podcast or on the YouTube channel. And I hope I will see you guys again next week on another episode of Short Stories of Bacteria. Hey everyone, thanks for watching that video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you liked what you saw, don't forget to hit that like, share, subscribe button, and I will hopefully see you guys in the next video. Later!